They told me it was only for 2 weeks. A necessary break, they called it. My hip was healing slowly after the clumsy fall in the kitchen. David and Clara insisted I stay at the local rehabilitation facility. They said the house was too much for me now. Too many stairs, too many memories. I didn't want to leave the house. I built that house 50 years ago, brick by brick with my own hands. Every scuff mark, every faded patch of wallpaper was a story of Eleanor and me, our life. But David said I was being selfish. He said I was resisting care. Clara nodded, her face tight with that polite concern she saved only for Sunday lunches and medical appointments. I finally agreed. I felt weak. I felt old. Maybe they were right. Maybe I needed help. I packed one small suitcase. David drove me to the facility. As we left, I looked back at the front door. The sturdy oak door, painted deep burgundy. The same door I had carried Eleanor over on our wedding day. I had a terrible feeling then, a cold, sinking dread that settled in my chest like damp concrete. I dismissed it. They were my children. They loved me. The 2 weeks passed slowly. The food was bland. The silence was thick. I called David every few days. He was busy. Clara was busier. They always promised to visit, but never showed. "We're just handling things at the house, Dad," David explained over the phone one evening. "Deep cleaning. Maintenance." It needed it. He sounded cheerful. Too cheerful. I remember thinking, the house didn't need maintenance. The house needed me. Finally, the physical therapist signed my release papers. I called David for the ride home. He sounded annoyed, as if my recovery was an inconvenience. "I'll be there around 5, he grumbled. "Don't rush the nurses." I waited in the lobby. The air conditioning was too strong. I held the handle of my old suitcase. I felt a nervous excitement. I was going home. When David pulled up, he didn't help me load the bag. He just leaned over and popped the trunk. We drove in silence. The route felt strange, familiar, yet unsettling. I noticed the trees looked greener than I remembered. The neighbor's dog barked loudly, welcoming me back. Then we rounded the final corner. The house appeared. It looked magnificent under the early evening light. The garden was slightly overgrown, but the silhouette was perfect. My house? David parked the car abruptly. He didn't turn off the engine. "Well, here you are, Dad, back in action." He still hadn't looked at me. I reached for the door handle. "Wait," he said. I paused. My hand froze on the chrome. "There's something we need to discuss first." David finally turned, his face carefully neutral. A business face. "What is it?" "We changed the locks," he stated casually, as if mentioning the weather. The air rushed out of my lungs. I felt a sudden ringing in my ears. "You... what?" "The security system was ancient, Dad, and the locks were worn. We had a proper professional come out today. High-grade brass. It took all afternoon." He spoke quickly, avoiding my eyes now. He stared at the dashboard. I tried to process the words. "Change the locks. David, my keys. I need my keys." "That's the thing, Dad. We think, moving forward, it might be better if we hold the keys." I stared at him. I tried to find the son I raised, the boy who used to hide behind that front door waiting for Christmas morning. I found only a cold, polished stranger. "Hold the keys? This is my house, David." "We know, Dad, but you're getting older, and you've been through a lot. Clara and I, we just want to protect you. We decided we will manage the property for now." Manage the property. That polite term for ownership. "Where am I supposed to sleep tonight, David?" My voice was low. I tried to keep the tremor out of it. "Oh, well." He shifted uncomfortably. "We set up the downstairs guest room for you. The one by the laundry. It's safer. Less chance of you falling on the main staircase." I looked at the front door again. The old familiar doorknob was gone, replaced by a gleaming, unforgiving brass handle and a thick, modern deadbolt, a clear, physical barrier. I was locked out of my own home. My own son had done this, while I was recovering, while I was vulnerable. "You didn't consult me," I whispered. "We didn't want to stress you out, Dad. It was a firm decision, for your safety." He reached into the center console and pulled out a small laminated card. "Here's your key for the downstairs door. This one leads directly into the laundry room and the guest suite. That room is yours. It was a separate entrance, a servant's entrance. They were sealing me off from the rest of the life I had built. I didn't take the card. I just looked at his hand, hovering between the seats. The laundry room, I repeated, the taste of ash in my mouth. It's cozy, Dad, really, and it's important we keep the rest of the house secure. Secure from whom? From me? The humiliation was a physical pain, sharp and immediate, carving through the quiet acceptance I'd maintained for weeks. They didn't see me as a father. They saw me as an obstacle, as equity. I opened the car door and stepped out onto the driveway. The gravel crunched under my worn leather shoes. The scent of pine needles and newly cut grass filled the evening air. It smelled like home, a home I could no longer access. I walked toward the porch. David stayed in the car, engine still idling. He didn't follow. I reached the front steps and placed my hand against the cold, smooth brass of the new lock. It was foreign, intrusive. Then I heard David lean on the horn lightly, a quick, impatient beep. Dad, let's get you settled. I have a dinner meeting. I turned back. David's impatience was the final insult. My dignity was less important than his evening schedule. I walked back to the passenger window. I looked at my son, the man I had funded through college, the boy whose broken bicycles I had fixed 100 times in the garage. David, I said, my voice dangerously calm, where is Clara? She's inside, getting your room ready. Tell her I need to speak to her. Now. He sighed dramatically, pulling out his phone. He clearly thought I was just having an old man's tantrum. A minute later, the inner curtain of the large living room window twitched. Then the front door, the locked front door, opened just enough for Clara to slip out and stand on the porch, pulling it shut firmly behind her. She wore a cashmere sweater, and her hair was perfectly neat. She looked every bit the mistress of the house. Arthur, she said, using my first name, a familiarity she adopted only when she wanted to establish her power. Welcome back. David, stop hovering. Let us talk. David just shrugged and stayed in the car, fiddling with the radio. He was done with the heavy lifting. I walked toward Clara slowly. I focused on her eyes, trying to gauge the depth of their deception. You changed the locks, Clara? I stated. Yes, Arthur. It was David's idea. For security. Look at this neighborhood now. We couldn't risk your safety. We needed to protect your assets. My assets, I repeated. The assets that are currently locked away from me. She offered a small, rehearsed smile. You're safe, Arthur. That's what matters. We've secured the title insurance and upgraded the monitoring system. Everything is protected. Did you really believe I wouldn't notice? We thought you would understand it was for your benefit. We are managing the upkeep. We have arranged for the bills to be consolidated under David's account. This simplifies everything. You just need to focus on resting. She spoke as if I were a child, or a patient incapable of thought, a non-person. You've been through so much, she added, her voice dripping with false sympathy. The worry about the house would only impede your recovery. The cold efficiency of their plan was breathtaking. They hadn't just changed the locks, they had begun transferring control of every necessary detail. They expected me to simply accept the fate of the downstairs room, the limited key, and the quiet surrender of my life. I looked past her, at the house. I could see the dim light from the hallway filtering through the stained glass panel next to the door. This was not security. This was an eviction. Clara, I said, leaning in slightly, forcing her to hold my gaze. The deed. Her perfect composure wavered, just for a fraction of a second. The deed, Arthur? Yes, the legal deed to this property. I assume you checked its status before you decided to manage my assets. She recovered quickly, smoothing the front of her sweater. Of course, Arthur. We have copies of everything. It's all in order. We know exactly what the status is. And what is that status, Clara? Well, she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. You are the original owner, yes. But with your current physical limitations, and David being your sole heir, it's standard practice to assume fiduciary responsibility and prepare for the inevitable transfer. The inevitable transfer. That was their timeline. They were rushing the inevitable. You acted quickly, I noted. We are efficient, Arthur. We want to ensure everything is seamless when the time comes. And you thought changing the locks before I even arrived home was part of that seamless process? Clara looked genuinely frustrated now. It was unfortunate timing. We apologize for the optics, Arthur, but the security was paramount. No, I corrected her quietly. Ownership was paramount, and the optics are exactly right, Clara. You locked me out. I saw the flash of anger in her eyes, quickly masked by her cultivated pity. She was tired of the performance. Arthur, please. Let's not make a scene. David is waiting. Come inside. Get settled. Dinner will be ready soon. She moved toward the door handle, ready to open the small slit that allowed access to the laundry room suite. No, I said, stepping back. She stopped. No? I am not going to the laundry room suite tonight. But where will you go? Genuine confusion. She hadn't anticipated defiance. They had planned for quiet resignation. I need time to think, I said, and I need to make some arrangements. I walked over to David's car. He had the window down, watching us. David, take me back to the facility, or a hotel. Any hotel. A hotel, Dad? Why? The room is ready. I am not entering my house through the laundry room door, I stated plainly. Not tonight, then not after this. David stared at me, then at Clara, who was shaking her head slightly, warning him not to escalate. Fine, David sighed, starting to back the car out. Be difficult. Get in. I looked at the house one last time. The brass lock glinted, reflecting the setting sun. I had always been honest with my family. I had always been transparent about my will and my intentions. I had never hidden anything from them, but they had hidden everything from me. As David sped away from the house, the physical distance gave me clarity. They thought they had cornered me. They thought vulnerability equaled helplessness. They thought the deed was simply a formality, something to be transferred eventually. But they had made a fatal mistake in their rushed takeover. David and Clara had relied on the assumption that I was incapacitated enough to forget the details. They assumed that because I was old, I was careless. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my tweed jacket, the one I always wore, the one Eleanor had bought me 20 years ago. My fingers brushed against the thick, folded paper inside. The paper wasn't a copy. It was the original. It wasn't filed in the safe deposit box they knew about, or the file cabinet they had undoubtedly searched. It was here, protected by the thin layer of tweed and the assumption of my dotage. A small, quiet smile touched my lips. I was locked out tonight, but they did not know the details of the deed. They did not know the conditions I had placed on the property years ago, conditions that only became fully active when I decided to exercise them. They had been very careful about security. They had forgotten about legality. I looked out the window as we passed the municipal park. I was calm now. The shock had burned off, replaced by a cold, sharp resolve. They wanted to manage my assets. They wanted control. I would show them exactly what control felt like. David, I said, breaking the long silence. Drop me off at the Fairmont Hotel downtown. I need a quiet place to organize my papers. He chuckled. Your papers, Dad? What papers? The important ones, I replied, staring straight ahead. The ones that determine who truly owns the door you just locked in my face. I spent the rest of the ride in silence, planning the long, cold night ahead. I had lost the initial battle for access, but they had not yet seen the end game. They were sleeping comfortably inside, secure in the knowledge that they held the keys. They had no idea that tomorrow morning I would be calling the most ruthless property lawyer in the city, and I would bring my documents. The very documents they assumed were already theirs. Tonight I was homeless, but soon they would be fighting to remain guests. The game had just begun. I needed to rest. I needed strength. Tomorrow, the quiet elder would become the sole owner of every power they had tried to steal. The bus smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. It was the longest 4 hours of my life, but I was finally coming home. That temporary stay felt like a cage, a polite, expensive cage. but still a cage. My daughter-in-law, Clara, insisted I needed rest. A week, she said, to recover from the stress of the previous month. I knew it was her way of getting me out of the way before the annual summer barbecue, but I agreed. I was tired. The call stopped 3 days in. I called Daniel, my son. No answer. I called Clara. Straight to voicemail. I told myself they were busy. Important work calls. Dealing with the big house. Planning the party. They had enough on their plate. But a cold knot started forming just below my ribs. It felt like bad water. As the bus pulled into the familiar downtown station, I felt a wave of genuine relief. Home. I needed my chair, my tea, the quiet hum of my own walls. I took the local taxi. The driver was young, chewing gum loudly. I looked out the window at the streets I had known for 60 years. They looked different now, faster. Then we turned onto Elm Street. Our street. The house came into view. It was strange. The shutters looked freshly painted. Not the muted green I'd chosen, but a harsh, glossy charcoal. New landscaping, too. Large, modern concrete planters, where my hydrangeas used to be. The taxi stopped at the end of the long driveway. I paid the driver. I watched him pull away. I was standing there, on the curb, with one small suitcase. The silence was wrong. Too big. I hesitated before walking up the drive. My legs felt heavy, weighed down by a sudden, inexplicable dread. Then I saw it. Tucked around the side of the garage, hidden mostly by the new prickly shrubs, was a large, industrial dumpster. A skip. It was overflowing, and I recognized the contents. My grandmother's mahogany writing desk, cracked and tilted, sticking out of the top. I hadn't used it for writing in 20 years, but it was where my husband proposed. Beside it, the worn Persian rug from the dining room, the one with the faded star pattern that I always said looked like the night sky. They weren't just clearing space. They were clearing history. My history. My hands started to shake. This wasn't preparation for a barbecue. This was an eviction. I remembered Clara's face when she had looked at the house before they moved in 2 years ago, right after Daniel lost his big promotion. Her eyes weren't focused on the family memories. They were focused on the square footage, on the potential for a modern, open-plan conversion. "It's a magnificent asset, Mother," she had purred, "but it needs a vision, a young vision." I had always insisted they didn't pay rent. Family, I reasoned. They were helping me keep the place up. I was generous. Perhaps too generous. My small garden tools lay scattered near the skip, abandoned. They looked like discarded toys. I put my suitcase down. I didn't want them to see me. Not yet. I walked slowly around the back of the house, trying to be silent. The sun was sinking, casting long, menacing shadows. Through the large kitchen window, I saw the blinding white glow of new recessed lighting. My cozy, cream-colored cabinets were gone, replaced by high-gloss black panels, and Daniel and Clara were standing there, laughing. They were sipping wine, expensive wine, judging by the label and the crystal glasses. They looked triumphant, relieved. They were talking animatedly, pointing towards the corner where my old pantry used to be. I strained to hear through the thick double-pane glass. I caught only fragments. "It finally done with the paperwork." That was Daniel. "Did you really think she was going to fight us?" That was Clara. Her voice was sharp, dismissive. "She hasn't even noticed the savings account is empty yet." Daniel chuckled, a sound that tore through me like cold steel. The savings account. The emergency fund I'd kept hidden for 60 years. I hadn't needed to check it while I was away. I hadn't needed to panic. Until this moment. They assumed I was oblivious, that I was weak, that the memory fog they constantly joked about was real. They had not just moved in. They had started liquidating my life. I stepped back quickly, hiding behind the large new compost bin. My heart hammered against my ribs. A furious, frightened drum. How long had this been planned? Was the sudden vacation just a distraction while they did the heavy lifting of bureaucratic theft? My mind flashed back to 6 months ago. The Christmas dinner. Daniel had brought home some papers, a complex stack of documents he said were required for liability insurance updates. He rushed me through the signature pages, pointing vaguely at the lines marked Parent Owner. "It's just standard procedure, Mom," he insisted, annoyed by my careful reading. "Don't hold up the evening. Everyone is waiting for dessert." Did I sign over the house that night? Was that the paperwork Daniel mentioned? Had I been so foolish, so trusting, so blind? The shame was a suffocating blanket. I, who had built this life brick by brick, had allowed it to be dismantled by my own blood, all for the sake of not inconveniencing a Christmas pudding. I reached for my phone, instinctively wanting to call a lawyer, the police. But who would I call? My son? The man who was currently toasting my demise with his wife? No. This was my battle. I remembered the promise I made to my late husband, Arthur, 40 years ago when we first got the mortgage. "We keep this house, Eleanor, no matter what. It's the roof over our heads and our future." We paid it off early. We saved every penny. We went without vacations, without new cars, so that we would have security in our late years. And Daniel knew that. He knew exactly what this house represented. It wasn't just wood and plaster. It was the entire foundation of my dignity. I felt the fear, the humiliation, and then, slowly, something hard and cold replaced them. A resolution. They assumed I was finished. They assumed I was an aging liability to be managed and forgotten. They assumed I was senile enough to have lost the original deed. But there were some things you didn't forget. Not if you had spent a lifetime protecting them. The key to the lockbox wasn't with my regular set. It was tucked inside the lining of the last winter coat Arthur ever wore. A heavy wool coat, stored in the cedar closet in the guest room. And the lockbox itself was behind the loose panel in the basement utility room, where the pipes meet the wall. I put it there because no thief ever looks at the boiler. The deed. The original notarized, stamped deed, registered 50 years ago. It had my name on it, just mine. They could forge signatures, they could empty bank accounts, they could throw out my grandmother's furniture, but unless they had convinced a very careless county clerk, the legal reality was still sitting behind a boiler pipe in a sealed metal box. I needed to get inside. I crept back toward the front of the house, staying low, moving carefully, like a shadow. They were still inside, celebrating their new prosperity. I reached the front porch. I stood on the welcome mat that still read, "Home Sweet Home." I reached into my pocket for the front, Dexter key, my old heavy brass key. I pushed it into the lock. It didn't turn. It didn't even engage. I tried again, jamming the key hard. The lock cylinder was new, shiny, unfamiliar. My hands went completely still. They hadn't just moved in. They had sealed me out. I was standing on my own doorstep, a ghost in the twilight, locked out of the house I owned. I took a slow, deep breath, tasting the cool evening air. The fear was gone now. Only the hard, cold core of resolution remained. I stood there for a long moment, looking at the newly painted front door that felt like a wall. I lifted my suitcase. I didn't knock. I didn't shout. I didn't announce my arrival. I needed the deed. I couldn't confront them without it. But they had locked the outside. I knew this house better than they knew their own hands. Every loose floorboard, every sticky window, every forgotten service entrance. There was one way in. The small, rarely used cellar hatch in the old tool shed, mostly hidden by the overgrown lilac bush. They would never have found it. I walked toward the shed, the sound of my single suitcase rolling quietly over the gravel. Tonight, I was not their mother. I was the silent owner, returning home for what was mine. And the first order of business was to retrieve the only weapon that truly mattered. The night had just begun. The air was thin and sharp that November night. It cut right through my thin travel coat, the one they insisted was suitable for my stay at Aunt Helen's, 3 states away. They changed the lock so fast. Did they wait until my flight took off? Or did they start drilling before the airport shuttle even left the driveway? I stood on the walkway, facing the granite steps I had paid for myself 30 years ago. The house was dark, but a single bedroom light was on upstairs. Their light. My son and his wife were inside, tucked into the life they had just stolen. My keys were useless, a meaningless jingle of metal in my trembling hand. It was not the cold that made me shake. It was the sheer, breathtaking audacity of the act. The final definitive statement. You are disposable. I walked to the end of the driveway and sat down on the low stone wall. I looked up at the window, not with anger yet, but with a profound, terrifying emptiness. The realization that the life I had built, the son I had raised, had been weaponized against me. They thought they had won. They truly believed I was stranded, panicked, and most importantly, defeated. They relied on my age. They relied on my perceived reliance on them. They relied on the cultural assumption that an old parent eventually just hands over the keys. They never accounted for the lifetime of paranoia I inherited from my father, who always taught me, trust is earned with deeds, not words. I sat there for 20 minutes, watching the upstairs light. No frantic phone calls, no banging on the door, no tears, only cold, silent planning. My first thought was, not revenge, it was safety. I needed a place to sleep that wasn't the curb, and I needed access to what they believed I had already given away. I got up stiffly and walked towards the main road. The cold dignity of walking away from your own front door is something you never forget. I didn't call my son. I didn't text. I didn't give them the satisfaction of hearing the distress in my voice or the realization of what they had done. I denied them their victory dance. I found a cheap, fluorescent-lit motel down the highway, the kind with thin towels and coffee that tastes like rust. It felt like exile, but it was safe. It was anonymous. I checked in using my maiden name and paid cash from the small emergency stash I always kept hidden in my travel bag. They didn't even cancel my secondary debit card yet. They were too confident. Lying on the scratchy motel bed, I closed my eyes and let the timeline reconstruct itself. They had been pushing for the title transfer for years. Ever since I retired and they started paying the higher property taxes, they acted as if they were doing me the favor. It simplifies the estate planning, Mom, my son had said, leaning over my desk, his voice dripping with concerned efficiency. You don't want the state taking half, do you? I nodded. I agreed. I even filled out forms. But I never signed the final one. I always had a reason. A notary was unavailable. My lawyer was on holiday. I needed one more week to review the financial implications. They grew tired of waiting. They assumed my procrastination was typical elderly forgetfulness, not a calculated delay. The power of attorney they convinced me to sign dealt only with financial accounts and medical decisions, contingent upon my incapacity. It did not, under any circumstances, allow them to transfer the title of the house. The house was not in the trust. It was not in the will. It was purely and simply mine, in my name alone. I had learned long ago that in life, the only truly solid ground is legal paperwork. Emotion is quicksand. The real deed, the heavy official document, was not at the house, where they had certainly searched the safe deposit box I told them held it. It was tucked away at the community credit union in a small rented safety deposit box, a box my son knew nothing about, linked to an account he didn't know existed. The next morning, before the sun was fully up, I was waiting outside the credit union's heavy glass doors. When they finally buzzed me in, the manager, Mrs. Harrison, recognized me immediately. We talked about the weather, about her grandkids, normal, quiet routines. I didn't tell her I was locked out of my home. I simply requested access to my box. The box was thin, long, and cold. When the clerk slid it across the metal table towards me, I felt a physical shift in my chest. The feeling of utter powerlessness from the night before evaporated. I inserted the key. Inside, nestled. Beneath a few outdated bonds and my father's old Navy medal was the document. Cream-colored paper, sealed and embossed with the county seal. The original notarized deed. I ran my finger over the raised stamp. This piece of paper, this single, quiet document, held the balance of power in my family. It held my retirement. It held their arrogance. They thought I was dependent. They thought I was foolish. They thought the old woman they shipped off for a long holiday was too frail to fight back. I left the credit union with the deed folded neatly in a manila envelope, tucked under my arm. My next stop was the office of Mr. Arthur Vance, the only lawyer I truly trusted. Arthur had handled my divorce 30 years ago. He specialized in quiet, devastating closures. Arthur's office was old money, dark mahogany, and whispered conversations. I didn't start with emotion. I started with fact. "Arthur," I said, placing the envelope on his massive desk. "My son and daughter-in-law changed the locks on my house last night. I need you to initiate immediate eviction proceedings based on this document." Arthur Vance, a man who rarely showed surprise, slowly put down his reading glasses. He picked up the deed, scrutinized the dates, checked the transfer stamps, and nodded, a slow, grim acknowledgement. "They've assumed occupancy, based on their payment of taxes and upkeep, I presume?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "They assumed occupancy based on greed?" I corrected him. "I gave them permission to live there while I decided on the estate details. They took advantage of a trip I made to see my sister." "And you never signed the final transfer of title?" "Never. The deed remains in my name, solely." Arthur smiled, a thin, satisfied, and slightly predatory curve of his lips. "This is very clean, Eleanor. Very clean indeed." We spent the next 2 hours outlining the strategy. It couldn't just be about getting the locks changed back. That would allow them to plead ignorance, to spin the story to the rest of the family, saying it was a misunderstanding or a mistake. No. They needed to understand the full cost of their betrayal. I needed to act fast, before they managed to scramble and concoct some excuse, or worse, forge a document. Arthur advised immediate action. A legal notice, served by a professional process server, stating that they were trespassing and must vacate the premises within 72 hours, pending court order. But I wanted more than that. I didn't just want them out. "Arthur," I said, leaning forward, "I want to sell the house immediately, as soon as they are gone. Do not give them a minute to believe they will ever step inside those doors again." He hesitated slightly. "Eleanor, that house is worth a substantial amount. It's where your son grew up." "My son threw me out of it," I said simply. "He traded that house, and my comfort, for the assumption of ownership. Let him live with the consequences of that valuation." Arthur Vance nodded, making a note on a yellow legal pad. "We will initiate the notice today. We will begin contacting real estate agents for a quick private sale immediately after they receive the notice. The final, crucial step," Arthur said, looking straight into my eyes, "is delivery." "What about delivery?" "You must not deliver the notice yourself, Eleanor. It complicates things emotionally and legally. But you should be present. You need to see their faces when they realize the game is over." I agreed. I wanted to see the exact moment the realization hit. They had stolen nothing and lost everything. We settled on the strategy. The notice would be served at the end of the business day, right when they were comfortable, settling in for the evening in my living room. I left Arthur's office feeling lighter, yet heavier. The sadness was still there, but it was anchored by purpose. I had not been defeated. I had been underestimated. I found a quiet coffee shop and sat by the window, watching the city rush by. I pulled out my phone. My son had texted me that morning, a bland message asking if I had settled in well at Aunt Helen's. A perfect lie, a final confirmation of his complicity. I did not reply to his text. I would communicate only through certified legal channels from now on. I spent the rest of the day in silent preparation, reviewing old photographs of the house, listing the exact items I wanted removed and stored. Not many, mostly heirlooms and documents. Everything else could be sold with the property. I realized that by locking me out, they had given me permission to be ruthless. They had severed the emotional connection to the property for me. It was no longer a home. It was a contested asset. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the pavement, I drove back toward the neighborhood. I parked around the corner, where the streetlights were dim and the oak trees hid my car. I waited. The process server, a muscular young woman with a stern face, was due any minute. I watched the windows of my house, their house, they thought, waiting for the moment of impact, the moment they opened the door to their supposed victory and found ruin waiting instead. The tension was almost unbearable. They were inside, talking, eating, planning their future in the space I had bought and paid for. Soon, the bell would ring. Soon, the paper would be in their hands. And then, I would make my presence known. But first, they needed to read the notice, and the name listed at the bottom, Eleanor Hayes, the sole owner. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. The night had truly begun. And unlike the previous night, this time, I held the key. The real key, the key of the law. I waited for the server's car to arrive, anticipating the terrible, delicious silence before the storm. I just needed to hear the knock, the sound that would signal the end of their comfortable illusion, the end of their theft. End of part 3. The taxi pulled up to the curb. It felt like a foreign country, my house, my garden. But the locks were new and the windows were cold. I paid the driver and stepped out onto the sidewalk. I carried only a small, heavy briefcase. It contained everything they thought they had taken. I stood there for a long moment, just watching. I saw the new curtains Darlene had chosen, a flashy, loud pattern that clashed horribly with the quiet character of the home John and I built. They had already redecorated. They had already settled in. They had truly believed it was theirs. I walked up the front path, slowly. Every step was a step toward the end of their assumption. It felt less like walking home, and more like walking into court. I pressed the new brass doorbell. It chimed a synthetic tune that I hated. The door opened. It was Jason. My son looked surprised, but not worried. He wore a satisfied, almost bored expression. "Dad?" he said, leaning against the frame. "What are you doing here? I told you we'd send your things to the storage unit next week." He spoke with the casual air of a landlord dismissing a minor tenant. "I'm here for the house, Jason," I said. My voice was flat, no emotion, no trembling. He laughed, a short, brittle sound. "Oh, right, funny. Look, we're having people over. Just send me an email later about whatever it is you need." He started to close the door. "Stop, Jason," I commanded. It was the tone I hadn't used since he was a difficult teenager, a tone of absolute, unyielding authority. He hesitated, startled by the sudden hardness in my voice. He opened the door again, slightly wider. Darlene appeared behind him, wearing a tight, smug smile. "What is it, Richard?" Darlene asked, crossing her arms. "Did you forget your wallet? You need to call first. We are busy setting up the new office space." She gestured inside to the dining room I had always used for family dinners. It was now filled with monitors and filing cabinets. "I am not here for a wallet, Darlene," I said. I held up the heavy leather briefcase. "I am here to inform you that you're trespassing." Jason frowned, the amusement gone. "Trespassing? Are you serious, Dad? This is our home now. We've been over this." "No," I corrected him quietly. "You assumed ownership. You did not secure it." I placed the briefcase on the small stone ledge beside the door. I unlatched the gold clasp. The click echoed in the silent afternoon. I pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. It bore the logo of the firm downtown, the most expensive firm downtown. 2 hours ago, I explained, my eyes meeting Jason's, my legal counsel filed a formal notice of eviction. Darlene gasped, a sharp, ugly sound. Jason's face went pale. The blood drained out instantly. "What are you talking about?" Jason stammered. "Eviction? That's insane. We live here. We took care of the mortgage. We took care of you." The lie hung between us, thick and shameful. "You took care of the mortgage payments I sent you," I clarified. "You took care of the property tax payments I forwarded. You did not assume the debt or the ownership." I looked straight at Darlene. She was shaking her head violently, dismissing me like a bad joke. "This is some kind of stunt, Richard," she spat out. "You can't afford fancy lawyers. You're retired." We control all the accounts now. I paid for the lawyers, I said, using the emergency fund your mother and I established 30 years ago. The fund you knew nothing about. The fund you didn't bother to look for. I handed the envelope to Jason. His fingers trembled as he took it. He didn't open it. He just stared at the professionally printed address. Occupant. This document outlines that you have 48 hours to vacate the premises, I continued. Effective immediately. Failure to comply results in the immediate involvement of the sheriff's department and charges of forcible entry. Jason finally found his voice, high-pitched and frantic. You can't do this, Dad. We put our savings into this place. We renovated the kitchen. We replaced the siding. You did that, I agreed softly, under the assumption of ownership. An assumption, Jason, that was never legally confirmed. I reached into the briefcase again. I pulled out a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. It was a certified copy of the filing. When you locked me out, I said, you claimed that since you managed the payments, the house was already transferred into your name. You seemed very sure of that. Darlene stepped forward, her face contorted in anger and panic. We were waiting for your signature, Richard. We were going to get you to sign the quitclaim deed next week. I murmured. The signature I never gave. The silence that followed was suffocating. They both understood now. They had been sloppy. They had been greedy, impatient, and utterly confident that I was too old, too sick, or too reliant on them to fight back. They had jumped the gun. They had changed the locks, but they had not changed the facts. I stared past them, through the hallway, and into the living room. I remembered watching television there with John the night before he died. I remembered raising Jason in those rooms. For 30 years, I paid every penny into this home, I stated. Every nail, every shingle, every square foot of soil belongs to me. Jason held the thick envelope like it was radioactive. You won't get away with this. We'll fight you. We'll drag this through the courts for years. Darlene nodded desperately. We'll claim elder abuse. We'll say you're mentally unstable. I smiled then. It was a cold, tired smile. You are welcome to try, Darlene. But the legal documentation, the bank records, and the deed itself tell a very different story. I closed the briefcase with a sharp snap. You see, when you locked me out, you based your actions on a fantasy. You assumed I was homeless. You assumed I was helpless. I adjusted my grip on the handle. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky a violent red. But tonight, I told them, my voice heavy with certainty, I am sleeping warm and safe. And tomorrow, I will ensure that the current owner of this property reclaims possession. Jason looked terrified. What current owner? Who is going to reclaim it? I paused, letting the fear build in their eyes. The time for guessing games was over. The time for the truth was at hand. Me, I said simply. I'm the current owner, Jason. And then, I gave them the final, crushing piece of information they needed to digest before the sun rose again. I still have the original deed. It is legally registered in my name, and tomorrow morning, I am filing a temporary restraining order against both of you, based on the criminal report of illegal trespass I filed this afternoon. Darlene shrieked, a sound of pure, helpless rage and despair. You filed a criminal report? Jason whispered, dropping the thick envelope onto the porch. Yes, I confirmed. And I did it this way, standing here, watching your faces as you realized that every cruel calculation you made was based on the wrong premise. I turned, leaving them framed in the doorway of the house they thought was theirs. Two figures, suddenly diminished, realizing the foundations of their new life were built on quicksand. I didn't look back. The taxi was waiting down the street. My only thought as I walked away was that the confrontation had begun. But the key piece of evidence, the heavy parchment I carried for decades, was still waiting to be shown. Tomorrow they would see the deed. They stared at the piece of paper in my hand as if it were a bomb. It was not a bomb. It was simply proof. I held up the deed. The original deed, stamped and sealed, naming me, as the sole owner of 47 years. Sarah's eyes flickered, moving rapidly from the official seal to the date, then back to the door, realizing I was still standing outside. Their faces went white. The smugness drained away, leaving a residue of raw panic. "This isn't real," Mark stammered. His voice was hollow, stripped of the authority he had been mimicking for months. "Oh, it is very real, Mark," I said. My voice was calm, calmer than I thought possible. "And it is current." He stepped toward me, reaching out, not to hug me, but to snatch the paper. I pulled it back instantly. "Do not touch me. Do not touch my property." The change in dynamic was immediate and painful. They had treated me like a resident alien, a temporary inconvenience in their home. Now, they were trespassers. Sarah began to cry, a high, irritating wail that wasn't sorrow, but pure frustration at a failed scheme. "You lied to us," she shrieked. "You told Mark you signed the papers years ago." "I told Mark many things," I replied, ignoring the noise. "But I never signed this house away. You simply assumed I did. Assumptions are dangerous, Sarah." Mark leaned against the newly painted front door, the expensive mahogany they installed last winter. "Why, Mom?" he whispered, desperate now. "Why keep the secret?" "It wasn't a secret, Mark," I corrected him. "It was leverage and protection. I thought perhaps I wouldn't need it. I hoped I wouldn't need it. But you insisted." I reached into my bag and pulled out the phone. My lawyer was on standby. "The locks you changed illegally." I spoke clearly into the phone. "Yes, I have returned. I have presented the deed. They are refusing me entry. Please call the non-emergency line now and alert them. I need peaceable entry to my residence." Mark lunged for the phone. "No, Mom, don't do this. We can talk." He was stopped cold by the sound of the siren, faint at first, then rapidly growing louder down the street. They had been so meticulous about planning my exile. They forgot one fundamental rule. You cannot lock an owner out of their own house without legal consequence. When the two officers arrived, the situation diffused quickly. The uniform, the badge, the authority, it shattered their bravado instantly. I handed the deed to the supervising officer. He studied it, then looked at the new brass locks. He turned to Mark and Sarah, his expression unreadable. "Sir, ma'am, this is her legal primary residence. You have changed the locks without the owner's consent. You must step aside and allow her entry immediately. This is not up for negotiation." Sarah started arguing about their furniture inside, about the time and money they invested in the renovations. The officer cut her off. "Your belongings will be secured, but you're not allowed inside this house starting now. You need to gather essential items and leave." Mark looked at me, his eyes pleading, seeking the soft spot he always knew how to find, the guilt he knew I always carried. But the cold outside air had cleared my head, the image of the changed locks. That was all I needed to remember. I nodded slightly to the officer. He instructed them to use the garage entrance, to quickly collect necessary clothes and documents. They were to be escorted and out within 20 minutes. I waited on the front porch until the door finally opened. Not by them, but by the officer, who used a tool to bypass the lock mechanism, a temporary measure until a professional locksmith could arrive. The moment I stepped across the threshold, the silence hit me. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of violation. They had changed everything. The scent was different, synthetic and sharp. My photos were gone from the mantelpiece, replaced by Sarah's abstract art. The walls, once a warm cream, were now a harsh, modern gray. It was still my house, but it was no longer my home. Not yet. I stood in the center of the foyer, feeling the cold weight of the keys the officer handed me. Keys to the old lock system, which were retrieved from my hidden spot in the pantry. Mark tried one last time. He came down the stairs, suitcase in hand, and stopped 3 feet from me. "Mom," he said, voice trembling, "we are family. Please. Think about what this looks like." "I have thought about it," I said, looking him straight in the eye. "It looks like a son who locked his mother out of her own house. That is exactly what this looks like, Mark." I turned away from him and walked straight into the dining room. I sat down at the heavy oak table, the one piece of furniture they hadn't dared to move, and pulled out my second phone. I called my attorney again. It is done, I informed her. I am inside. I need the formal eviction notice served tomorrow morning. Personal service. I want them out of the house completely within 48 hours. Mark froze behind me. He hadn't heard the whole conversation, but he heard eviction notice and 48 hours. Mom! His voice was a shout now, filled with genuine terror. I finished the call, placing the phone gently on the table. I looked at my son, standing in the doorway of the room where we used to share Sunday dinners. You changed the locks, Mark. You chose your side. This is what comes next. He tried to plead, to argue necessity, to talk about their mortgage, their jobs, their children. I listened to all of it in silence. A cold, heavy silence I had perfected during the weeks of being ignored in my own kitchen. When he finished, I only asked one question. Did you really believe I was so stupid? Did you truly think I had nothing left to protect myself with? He couldn't answer. He just stood there, defeated by his own greed. The officer returned, confirming they had collected basic belongings and were waiting outside in their car. They were going to stay at Sarah's sister's house temporarily. As the house emptied of their frantic, selfish energy, I started to breathe normally again. The locksmith arrived an hour later. I stood watching as he drilled out the expensive new brass locks Mark had installed, replacing them with stronger, simpler mechanisms. I kept the new keys clasped tightly in my hand. I was alone now, surrounded by the wreckage of our trust, standing in a house that felt like a museum of betrayal. The victory was mine. But victory against your own child tastes like ash. I walked up the newly carpeted stairs, past the ugly modern prints, to my old room. They hadn't repurposed my bedroom, thankfully, but they had boxed up every single personal item of mine, stacking the boxes neatly in the walk-in closet. They had sanitized the room of my existence, preparing it for a guest room, perhaps. I sat on the bed, feeling the exhaustion settle deep into my bones. Deux de poids. Physical act of fighting them was over for tonight, but the real fight was just beginning. They would certainly challenge the eviction. They would fight for every dollar they spent on this house. They would try to turn the grandchildren against me. I knew the darkness of their capabilities now. I lay down, still fully dressed, pulling the heavy quilt over me. The locks were changed, yes, but they would change back. I was home. Tomorrow the lawyer would serve the papers. Tomorrow the consequences would begin to unfold, not just for them, but for me too. Tomorrow I had to decide exactly what kind of future I was building in the ruins they left behind, because if I evicted them, the house would be empty, and I had been told my purpose was to keep the house alive. I closed my eyes, the cold, smooth key digging into my palm. The hardest decision was still waiting in the morning light.